Good evening, everyone. I'm Hannah Davey, an engineering consultant here at ADAS. Thank you for joining us this evening. Before we get started, I just thought we'd go through some housekeeping points. So the webinar is being recorded and will be available for you afterwards. Everyone will be muted and cameras will be switched off throughout the whole session. This is just to help with background noise and any distractions. If you have any questions during the presentation, please pop them into the chat and we'll do our best to answer as many possible at the end of the webinar. And also basis points are available and the form will be in the chat to complete. So this evening we will be talking about permitted development and planning, biodiversity net gain, habitat, and nutrient neutrality, ammonia and air quality, and example approaches to ammonia screening. Like I say, questions will be at the end if we have time. So I will now pass you over to Charles Bentley and Brendon Hunter.
Okay, bear with me and we'll make a steady start, as we've got quite a few booked and still a few to join us by the look of things. I will just make sure that everything is working properly and see if I can flick onto the next slide. Right, so the first thing to say is that I'm here. I'm an agricultural engineer. I'm technical director for ADAS's agricultural land management team and specialising in farm infrastructure, and have done for the last 30 odd years. I am not and could never be described as a planning consultant, and nor could Brendon. We are technical specialists and we have found ourselves increasingly getting drawn into planning discussions, usually when something has gone wrong or awkward questions. So we've probably got a slightly jaded view. We get to see the gnarly ones, the difficult jobs, things that aren't quite as straightforward as they should be. And this is really just an opportunity from us to try and get over some of the things that we've encountered and some of the challenges, and to help awareness, I suppose, of some of the wrinkles of getting projects off the ground. So why does it matter? Well, farmers are investing in new buildings and slurry storage and facilities, and having to do so to keep up to date, to replace time expired and worn out kit, to cope with shortages in labour, to help to improve performance and hopefully profitability, and to comply with continuing and increasing regulation, particularly in respect of slurry storage. But regulation on the planning side, on the development end, is becoming more complex. The areas that impinge on getting a new shed, getting a new slurry store up on the farm, and as it says on the title, more livestock, more slurry, more manure, greater scrutiny. So things are becoming tighter. Planning, if you've not got all of your ducks in a row, or difficult questions that hadn't been anticipated arise, can take a long time. Long delays are increasingly common. We used to say, oh, well, you'll need at least 13 weeks, 3 months or so to get your planning through. Well, there have been some projects, some jobs we've come across where it's taken 2 years. Some of that is a shortage of staff in the planning teams, but some of it is because things have become much more complex. And doing your homework, checking Magic to see where you are, what the issues may be that are going to arise with your chosen site is really quite important to consider what you want to do, where, and what issues might arise, what mitigation there may be. You can reduce the risk and involve rework. So we have been doing our best to support clients navigating these layers of complexity and development, so we can try and get schemes off the ground smoothly and as relatively painlessly as possible. So the two potential approaches, because pretty much everything you do is likely to require consent of some size, shape or form. And we are here principally talking England, though, and to a lesser extent Wales. I do note that there are some delegates, some attendees from, well, right across the UK and further afield. So bear with us. These are dealing, as I say, principally with England and to a lesser extent with Wales. Permitted development is in some ways the farmer's old standby. Limited categories of farm development can be carried out without full planning. It's a process of prior notification. They used to call it 28-day notice. But there are limits to it. It's more straightforward in some respects than full planning. It doesn't get you into some of the awkward questions, but that doesn't necessarily absolve you of the responsibilities that go with it. Prior notification PD applications have to be reasonably necessary for the purposes of agriculture. They've got to be suitably located, so slurry and livestock accommodation, cattle housing needs to be at least 400 metres from the nearest protected dwelling. So that's your the neighbour or the barn conversion up the road. There are limits on extent, and they vary depending on the nature of the proposed development. So in England, that's 1,500 square metres for a building. Still the old 465 square metres, I believe, in Wales. And half a hectare in either for an excavation and potentially some slurry lagoons, so below ground storage can go through as excavation or have gone through as excavations. Sites in national parks, national landscapes, as they are now, AONBs as they were, and conservation areas have different rules, as do sites within or adjoining sensitive designated sites potentially. The other element, other than assessment in siting design and external appearance with PD, is that the statutory consultees, so Natural England and the Environment Agency, or NRW, would not conventionally be consulted. The planners may consult internally within the local authority, but it doesn't get you out of the sustainable drainage requirements in Wales. For developments over 100 square metres need SUDS approval. It's a very simple concept, and actually it's likely to be a requirement to some extent with a full application in England, looking at how surface water is returned to the environment, ensuring that your new development doesn't pose a flood risk downstream, so soakaways, attenuation ponds, rainwater harvesting and the like. Very simple concept. Absolutely horrible form in Wales. It's designed to cope with a new housing estate of 500 dwellings, I think, and goes on for many, many pages. But they've also got to be appropriate. So the legislation that drives the SUDS requirements in Wales actually extends to England, but it's never been enacted, brought in 2015. So it's there lurking in the background potentially, and may become a requirement in future as we have pressures of climate change, depending on the politics around red tape and regulation. So choosing the right route, if you can save cost. A PD application is or was slightly more expensive than the cheapest of the full planning applications, but in general, because fees increase with increasing size of development, then full planning is likely to cost you more, simply in fees to the local authority, but also in the other bits and pieces that go along with it. So full planning, formal applications, muck stores within 400 metres of the neighbour, and so on and so forth. Or if you've used up your permitted development rights on other projects in the last couple of years. Full planning is wider consultation internally with the local authority, the Environment Agency or NRW for slurry and manure stores, silage clamps, potentially for livestock housing, Natural England, and again NRW in relation to air quality and protected places, which we'll come on to in far more detail later. So there's greater scrutiny, other people asking awkward questions, and longer timescales. And in England, there's also the Biodiversity Net Gain requirement to take into account. That element will also come with a requirement for additional surveys with the planning, with the validation, potentially archaeology, ecology, and maybe some specialist ecological surveys if they identify that there are habitats on or adjacent to the site that may be affected, particularly things like bats where there's demolition, even under bats between the cladding and the frame on a Crendon asbestos cement concrete building are by no means unheard of. Yes, the ecologists can probably do the BNG baseline assessment while they're there, but that's still additional cost if you have to go down that route. So think about where you're doing things. Choose your location. So this is a little example of a job that we did relatively recently. The first choice location was there about just at the end of the lane there, the extreme southern end of the buildings, the bottom end of the farm, the valley bottom. Potential for a possible gravity feed there. Really good access. Looked like the best place to put it from the functional point of view from the farmer's perspective. But it was just within 400 metres of the neighbour's new barn conversion. So that one would have been full planning. The second choice location just west of the buildings alongside the existing slurry store, so the top end of that red and white, orange and white barred ruler, was 430 metres from the neighbour. It was the wrong side of that purple line, which we'll come to later, which could have brought some complications in terms of air quality and ammonia screening with full planning. It was perfectly feasible to operate that site with pumped transfer from a below ground tank in the building where the Sea of Magic is. There on top of the buildings next to the red line, and indeed, even if we'd put the store down to the south there, we were still going to have to pump out of it for most of it. But we considered it, talked it through with the client, and went for that second choice location. It wasn't a bad spot. Access was pretty good from a filling and emptying point of view. Didn't lose much useful ground. And was far enough away to be permitted development, and the scheme was approved. The Environmental Health did actually comment internally and were concerned about odours for the neighbour and actually for the school, which was about a mile away. But in this instance, the planning officer basically said it's 400 metres to the south, the wind's not blowing that way, there's a big open store there already, don't be silly, or words to that effect. However, what I would say is don't compromise your plans just to save short-term hassle and relatively minor expense. So yes, it's more complicated. Yes, there would have been some surveys there for BNG. The habitat lost wouldn't have been particularly spectacular. The need to provide the gain wouldn't have been desperately expensive. And compared with the cost of the new tin tank, really it would be peanuts. But this one went forward fairly straightforwardly. Yeah, your slurry store is going to be there for the next 20 to hopefully 40 years. So it does need to be right, but it's worth taking these elements into account. BNG became a legal requirement in England under the Environment Act. So they are looking for a minimum of 10% net gain for all new developments, and that includes farm projects needing farm full planning. So in England, the building ceiling for permitted development, 1,500 square metres, is below the BNG threshold of 2,000 square metres, 0.2 of a hectare. So that's actually recently been changed, and that's coming into force this summer. Small sites, using the small sites metric, you don't necessarily need an ecologist to do this for you, just some suitably competent person. Mitigation can be relatively simple, but it needs, from a farming point of view, to be practical and realistic. But there are, low-cost resilience boosting options out there that can be used. Looking at hedgerow planting, where that's an enhanced habitat, and buffer strip and grassland options where that's appropriate. So, what's involved with BNG? I have to credit my colleague, Mr. Hunter, and his AI skills with coming up with the illustration. Yes, it is a computer-generated image. It's not where I'd suggest you put a lagoon. So what's involved? Well, you need to score the existing habitats to assess the habitats using Natural England's Biodiversity Net Gain metric, either the full one or the simplified version for small sites, for smaller sites. It is a beast of a spreadsheet, particularly until you've really got to know your way around it. So the process is to quantify the current value, and to be fair, most agricultural development sites aren't particularly valuable from a biodiversity point of view. They tend to be bits of rough ground around the back of the sheds, covered in demolition rubble and scrap machinery, or bits of improved grassland, or the adjoining calving paddock. You assess the post-development score, so that looks at the area that's developed and taken out of the equation, so what you've lost from what was there before, and what you can do, therefore what you need to do around that to supplement and bring you up to that 10% as a minimum figure, and hence demonstrate your net gain. You're looking really to do so on site if you can, and to ideally use the same habitats those of higher value, and enhance those the biodiversity in that way. So one of the things we'd identified is there is a balance between having a site area that is sufficient to allow you to achieve what you need to on site, but that excludes habitats that you don't need to include. So one of the jobs we did, we was surrounded on two sides by a hedge. The red line boundary was going to include the hedge to start with, and then it became apparent that if we did that, we were going to need to find some means of producing 10% more hedge, even though it wasn't going to be damaged or destroyed. It was in part of the site, so it was going to have to be, we were going to need more of it. So drawing the red line boundary inside the hedge rather than outside of it took that issue away. And in that instance, by getting the site area right, we were able to convert the area of modified grassland, which was lost by the construction of the lagoon and its surrounding banks, with other neutral grassland, so a relatively species-rich mix with a target condition of good. So that's pretty much what Brendon's done in that slide. You may or may not need the hedges. You probably need a little bit more of the grassland, and I'd be inclined to lose the hard track all the way around, as it's unnecessary and it increases the developed area at the expense of the new habitat. And you probably won't need the orchard there either. But those hedges, that patch might need to be a bit bigger to get the numbers that you need. So it costs. You've got a suitably competent person to do that and go through and come up with the cunning plan. And on the larger sites, that's going to be a professional ecologist. So the assessment and the BNG design is going to add probably at least £1,500 to 2,000 upwards to your project costs. And achieving that BNG can be inexpensive, but equally it can get pretty costly if you have to. BNG, not an issue with permitted development, not an issue in Wales. It's currently England only. Next element that's come in relatively recently, so legislation dating from 2017 and starting to really make itself felt, are the habitats regs and the habitats regs assessment process. That's come in with the conservation of habitats and species regs. It applies across the whole of the UK and in particular relates to special areas of conservation and SPAs. They will, you will see them as SSSIs, but actually it's the underlying, what was the European designation under them that triggers this requirement. So it's non-negotiable legal framework, and it's what lies behind what we have to do with nutrient neutrality in some catchments and with ammonia assessments. Even if a scheme qualifies permitted development, technically it shouldn't proceed if it risks breaching the habitats regs, and we've seen one or two local authority letters to that effect, though in practice they tend to neglect it, and actually the enforcement mechanism outside of the planning scheme seems to be something of a grey area. So it's the local authority that have to make the decision as to whether there's a need for, there's a likely significant effect, to screen it, to undertake an appropriate assessment, though they may ask the applicant to provide a shadow assessment, and then if the effects can be ruled out, it can go ahead. If they can't, then an alternative approach, further mitigation, different way of doing it will need to be looked at. And this can be where early design choices and mitigation, so going for a covered store or low emission flooring in the housing and making sure you've got your nutrient planning and slurry spreading areas lined up, can make the difference between something that comes bouncing back from the planners and you have to start again and choose how you go, or something that goes through, albeit steadily and painfully. So on the nutrient neutrality side, that affects areas which are basically draining to special areas of conservation where the aquatic environment is one of the reasons for designation. So that includes the Camel down in Cornwall, big patch through central southern England, Poole Harbour catchment, anything discharging into Poole Harbour, or the Solent, so the Test, the Itchen, the Hampshire Avon, and so on and so forth. The Eden in East Anglia, and some of the rivers up there in the north, And also, actually, 6 out of the 9 SAC river catchments in Wales have nutrient neutrality issues. They're exceeding their targets for phosphorus, but the approach, the issue isn't really yet affecting agricultural development. The planners and NRW are interested, but we've not yet been called to demonstrate that our proposals for a new facility are nutrient neutral. What do I mean by nutrient neutrality? Well, it's that a new development must show no net increase in the loading of the relevant nutrient. It's going to be nitrogen or phosphorus, occasionally both, to the sensitive catchments. That is a shot, I think, if I remember rightly, it's top end of the test in Hampshire, which is one of the catchments. The local authorities have set up nutrient calculators for housing development. They're very straightforward in some respects. They look at the number of people in the house, the size of the house. They assume 110 litres a day of water throughput, and that all goes down the sewer with a standard nutrient loading in the sewage. It then goes through the sewage works and the sewage and comes out the other end stripped of most of its nutrients, but there's a residual nutrient loading for the discharge water, and that's what needs to be offset in a residential or a commercial development environment for the lifetime of that development. So the phrase is in perpetuity, which is taken to be 80 years for housing, or the lifetime of the development for commercial development. So those calculators and don't work for ag. The housing developer will buy some a redundant pig farm and decommission it. They'll take land out of, buy additional ground, take land out of production, or buy nutrient credits elsewhere from an offsetting scheme, a wetland that somebody's designed and built and taken the credits for converting the land from its previous use. So this approach, the not increasing nutrient loading to sensitive catchments, is a bit restricted in some ways in its overall scope. Doesn't include what another might choose to do with bagged fertilizer or imported manures, but so the mechanism is effectively through the planning process. As I've said before, the authority can't approve development which will increase the nutrient input catchment, at least not without a very good argument as to why they should. So livestock housing, where there may be an increase in stock numbers, slurry and manure stores which appear likely to be associated with increases in stocking, lagoons, dwellings will all trigger assessment issues whether nutrient inputs may rise. So this really relates to expansion plans. Farmers, in contrast to buying credits elsewhere, can do things via demonstrating that their approach isn't going to increase the loading, so crop nutrient balancing, matching their stock nutrient outputs to crop demand, improving slurry management, so you're making better use of those materials and dealing with emissions that are coming through the spreading side, and potentially changing land use in other areas to offset. So even small expansion, anything frankly, will raise the question if the site's within the sensitive catchment. So we very often have to say in big friendly capitals at the bottom of the slurry store application that this approach is to increase the effective storage period for the current livestock numbers, and no expansion is not associated with any expansion. As I said, it's easy but not cheap for a new housing development. On farm, you can model it using FarmScoper, bit of a blunt instrument, but it can be done. Or you can demonstrate the balance through nutrient management planning, use of buffer zones, potentially cover crops on losses if you're not already doing it, and export of manures outside the catchment, or the use of wetlands and land change. So be careful with farm gate nutrient budgets. They should likely to show a surplus even when crops and soils are in deficit, as the systems are inherently leaky. Farm gate balance looks at exported crop offtake, milk, grain, livestock against inputs, purchased feed, fertilizer and livestock. There's likely to be a surplus at the farm gate, but nutrient efficiency is not 100%. So a zero farm gate balance will result in declining indices and yields. 50 kilograms a hectare of nitrogen surplus is pretty impressively low, but it looks bad to a regulator. So you may need to look at export from the catchment and very careful nutrient planning. We did a job in Somerset where we looked at nutrients required for planned cropping on the additional land accounted for the increase in output from a 10% increase in the herd. With a job in Wiltshire, that one was fortunate. They'd got land within a nutrient neutrality catchment and land outside, and it was possible to demonstrate there was going to be no more nutrient, no more phosphate going into the sensitive catchment from the additional output from a 20% increase in the herd. But it was a very close run thing, and if you end up being tied to that lower ceiling, what you did last year with the lower numbers, then you're going to end up with declining indices and potentially reduced performance in due course. And don't shoot yourself in the foot. We've seen increased phosphate inputs as a result of the change from soya to rape meal. Get things straight for once. And as I say, you need to watch for shortfalls in nutrient supply, as it could end up as a planning condition. We've seen requirement to abide by a manure management plan proposed as a condition. We've not seen this balance approach required as a planning condition yet. I can see that coming. So just watch your indices. That's a very simplified example of expansion from 100 to 200 cows. So these are big bucket and spade figures, assuming 200 hectares in total, of which 100's mowing ground, 50 hectares at index 2 and 50 at index 3. Well, with 100 cows, you've got a deficit. If it's only the 100 cows on the farm, then you're short of 3 tonne of phosphate to get up to RB209 recommendations. If you double the numbers with index 2 and 3, then you just about break even. There's enough there to go round. If you double the numbers, but some of the ground's index 3 and the rest of it's 4, then you're scuppered. You're going to be about 4 tonne over. So what you're looking at and what you're proposing needs to be to match crop and soil needs, so compliant with the farming rules. It is a little bit artificial because actually what we're looking at with the nutrient neutrality is for the lifetime of the project. And actually, if you're applying in accordance with RB209, then you should be moving towards a steady state of index 2. And actually, this surplus effect is only a medium-term issue until you can cut your export enough, until you can erode those indices down to the point where you can start spreading again. But it is important not to get tied to that 100 cow level of inputs, because otherwise you're never going to be able to expand without exporting, and you're going to end up being eroding your soil indices very, very rapidly. So I think that's about the end of my session. So I will hand over to Brendon to look at the air quality side of things and the entertainment that is unfortunately associated with dealing with ammonia emissions.
Thanks, Charles. So before I get into discussion around ammonia, I'll probably briefly introduce myself. So I work with Charles Bentley as principal consultant. Work sits around farm infrastructure, environmental risk and planning support. I'm often involved where agriculture developments need to be considered alongside soils, water, slurry and silage infrastructure and nutrient management. Generally looking at sort of protected sites and regulatory requirements. So quite a broad area of work I'm involved with. And with regard to ammonia, my role has been more at the planning and technical advisory end, reviewing ammonia and nitrogen issues in agriculture planning cases, looking at mitigation, sometimes sense checking assessment scope and helping clients understand what is likely to be required from the outset, hopefully, most of the time, instead of being sort of thrown in there at the deep end when things have already been progressed beyond a certain point. So what I want to do is set the scene for anyone who is less familiar with ammonia. Appreciate there may be a few advisors on here and things who may be well up together with the situation with ammonia and have probably seen some of these slides a million times, but there may be others that haven't. So I wanted to just touch on the background. So national background, government targets, why it's an issue, why ammonia is an issue, and why agriculture is sort of central to that, and then how this sort of starts to affect livestock and farm infrastructure proposals in the planning system. I'll then move on to the sort of process we've been following in practice. So really I mean, there'll be other examples that people will be aware of and may have even been involved with, but obviously we're just talking from our own experience of cases that we've specifically worked on in specific parts of the country with specific local authorities and planning officers. So there are going to be other situations where slightly different approaches may have been appropriate or have been taken. So this chart on the slide is an update of a previous one that's produced, which basically just shows that most of the other main pollutants since the 70s really have all reduced. But ammonia is still up there in line with the index line, and hasn't particularly reduced that much over that time period. So just zooming in on the national context and government targets for ammonia. So just this chart shows that in 2024, ammonia emissions were around 256,000 tonnes, which is about 17% below 1990 levels. But whilst emissions have reduced over the long term, in the last 20 years, they've not really significantly dropped any further. Under the national emission ceiling regulations, which we've signed up to as a country, the UK's got a duty to try and reduce emissions by 8% below 2005 levels for 2020 to 2029 period. So we've achieved that already. So we're already sort of at that target. So emissions were 9% below the 2005 levels recently when it was recently looked at. So we're meeting the target. By 2030, obviously, we've got more of a target to hit there. The target becomes 16% reduction. So that means we've got to make further reductions of around 20,000 tonnes of ammonia. So the point is ammonia emissions are falling slightly. The UK is currently compliant, but there's still a gap to meet the targets. And this is why ammonia remains a key consideration within government policy, regulation and planning. So before moving into the planning process bits, just to cover off a bit around why ammonia is a concern in the first place. Obviously, from a plan perspective, the main issue we come across is usually the effect on sensitive habitats. So ammonia concentrations in the air can sort of kill off sensitive plants and deposit on the ground, causing acidification. Nitrogen deposition has sort of similar impacts. And in the wrong habitats, sensitive habitats, nitrogen acts like a fertilizer, which of course can cause more coarse species like grasses, nettles, and other competitive species to grow while reducing sensitive plants, wildflowers, mosses, lichens, those kind of things, which might underpin certain habitats, the reason why they've been designated. So over time, that can change the character and ecological value of a habitat, and this matters because many protected sites are already exposed to ammonia pressure, so they're already in exceedance of concentrations and deposition values, which are going to cause impacts. So if you have added developments, it's going to make the situation worse. So the UK trend reports found ammonia above 1 microgram per cubic meter on at least 78% of triple SIs. Similarly, higher levels on European protected sites as well. The habitats regulations protected sites, similar sorts of levels, 50 to 60% of levels are exceeded. So it's quite an issue. Many of the sensitive sites is already a big issue there. So the point is that not every site is failing because of ammonia, but many designated sites are already within an ammonia pressure zone. So the other issue, obviously, is that ammonia can react in the atmosphere with other pollutants and form particulate matter. This has wide-ranging implications for respiratory diseases in humans, in us, and in cities, London, Birmingham. Recent research has found between sort of 25 and 40% of the particulate matter found within those cities is resulting from ammonia being blown in from the outside agricultural areas. So the key message is that ammonia is not simply a farm odor issue, it links to agricultural emissions, protected habitats, and wider air quality issues. Probably seen this figure before, an updated figure, the most recent emissions ammonia inventory. 89% of UK ammonia emissions, come from agriculture. Variety of areas. I mean, there's various stats on this. The particular chart I've got is looking specifically at cattle, other livestock types against biosolids digestate. So you can see cattle are the predominant source of ammonia, generally across the beef and dairy sector, with poultry and pigs to a lesser extent, fertilizer, another big one, and smaller contributions from digestate and biosolids. Obviously, pigs and poultry, they've already got regulations in place in terms of permitting regime, so to some degree there is already some control in place there. So just to give a little bit more context, Clean Air Strategy 2019, the direction of travel was clear back then. This is quite a long time ago now. Show that agriculture was a dominant source of ammonia, and they pointed towards a strategy which would include actions to reduce emissions, improving manure and slurry management, low emissions farming techniques, fertilizer use, urease inhibitors, potentially permitting for dairy and intensive beef systems similar to the pig and poultry, and things like covering of lagoons. Now, some of those things have sort of come to fruition. Other things like covering lagoons doesn't look like it's going to come about anytime soon. Permitting, we've done some work on that before, looking at the potential possibilities for the Environment Agency, and since we've done that piece of work, nothing's really happened on that front yet, but it potentially could be coming at some point soon. So there's an increased focus on it in the agricultural sector, which is obviously feeding into the planning. So our experience of ammonia and planning applications to date. So when we first started consulting on ammonia emissions, we sort of were following the approach which was being taken for intensive livestock units in terms of the ammonia screening. So a lot of the structure was initially the same. We found there's quite a lot of inconsistency across the councils and consultation areas because it was a very sort of new thing for livestock housing, for cattle housing projects specifically. And yeah, so our approach is always ask a few sort of basic questions around habitats protected, ecological receptors, and those have, were those, and we've sort of looked at, well, they've highlighted they need to be assessed, but are those habitats really that sensitive to nitrogen or not? Are they, so are they actually going to be impacted by the proposal? And does the proposal reduce or increase emissions compared to the baseline? So there was some basic things we were sort of doing there on the screening front. Not every development automatically makes the situation worse, and we've been involved with applications where proposals involve roofing or covering existing manure or slurry infrastructure, replacing an older system, or changing management in a way that could reduce emissions, which required us to take a different evidence-based approach to show that there was a reduction in emissions. And equally, where sensitive receptors are close enough, a more formal scale assessment or detailed modelling has been required, basically. Natural England have recently issued new standing advice in October 2025, and that's important because it's given the planning authorities a clear direction as to what the assessment process should be. And that includes first-time planning proposal applications for agricultural infrastructure, such as slurry stores and animal housing, changing how slurry and nutrients in existing animal housing are used, and proposals where there is an increase in herd or flock size. And the guidance applies to basically protected sites, triple SIs, and European protected sites covered under the habitats regulations. They've got different. So once a proposal is in scope, like I've just sort of mentioned, the different proposals, it then needs to be considered whether the scale of the development meets the criteria set out in the guidance and whether it's within the screening distance of different sites. So we've got these different screening distances, which we can sort of apply there. So, for example, if it's a manure store and it's less than 3,500 tons, then the 5 kilometre screening distance wouldn't apply. So you just have to sort of match the scale of the development to the screening distance and then apply that to the assessment criteria. Once the relevant screening distance and source within your proposed development has been identified, you can use a scale agricultural tool, or magic map can be used to identify sites within those screening distances. And if no protected sites are identified, generally no further air quality assessment would normally be required. However, you should consult the local planning authority to ensure there are no other sites which might need to be considered for impact. So, for example, sometimes we've had it where there's no triple SIs or SPAs, but the local ecologist wants us to take into account impacts on some very specific ancient woodland or local wildlife sites. So it's just because we've got this guidance in place doesn't mean to say that the local authority is not going to have their own policy on it. And some LPAs have been much more forward thinking than others in the approach they've taken. So this slide sort of simplifies the version of the whole process. So if protected sites are identified within range for a given development, the next question is whether the relevant habitats or features are sensitive, and then what the proposed development could potentially contribute in terms of pollution. So the guidance uses the process contribution, so the total emissions produced from that new development, which is essentially predicted additional pollution in terms of ammonia and nitrogen deposition from the proposal compared against relevant sensitivity thresholds for the protected habitats. So they've got a 1% threshold, and that's important. If the process contribution is 1% or more of the relevant critical level or load for a particular site, then further assessment steps are needed. For agricultural proposals, there is also a baseline question: does the proposed scheme increase emissions compared with the current activity, or does it reduce them? And then that can be important where a scheme involves covering existing slurry stores or manure infrastructure, changing housing design, or improving manure handling. So if there's a decrease in the baseline, then that can be a good thing that we can demonstrate. There's also a 25% test, which is about whether the existing source is already a dominant source within the area. There's a little bit of a different approach to what we've had to take before. And if the current activity already contributes 25% or more of the relevant critical load or level, then considering emissions reductions through mitigation may not be available for that particular scheme. So the key practical message of all of this really is for farmers and advisors, it's important to engage at an early stage with the process. Early ammonia screening helps to identify constraints before the layout is fixed. If there is a sensitive receptor nearby, mitigation can often be designed in through siting, covers, housing design, or slurry and manure management, and that keeps options open and helps control costs and reduces the risk of late planning delays or more expensive modelling which you might have to undertake. So to give a bit of an example here, this was the farm I was advising around the slurry storage. They'd already put in place plans to build a slurry store at the bottom end of that orange line within 360 metres of a sensitive triple SI. They got stuck in the planning process, had a chat with them about it, said, look, get the slurry infrastructure grant schemes there. I think your only option if you want to increase storage and get it through planning may well be in this situation to move it to the other side of the farm and change from a slurry lagoon to a tin tank design. Obviously, vastly different costs associated with that, but with the slurry infrastructure grant, that might have been the only feasible option for them to actually be able to get their slurry storage in place. Another case study that we had, just to look at development that I worked on. So there's a 330 cow dairy unit, £3 million investment planned, replacing 1970 sheds with robotic cubicles and slurry robots. So it's going to be a cleaner setup, lower emissions. It's been stuck in the planning system for about a year. I don't know. Yeah, it came across my desk somehow. I sort of got involved with it. So the plan was to demolish the old buildings. You can sort of see the number one on the plan. Build a new dairy unit, all enclosed milking robots and slurry robots on the site of the silage clamps. Move the silage clamps across the farm, and retain the 2 existing slurry stores. Sounds like a sensible approach. I would have said, to be fair. So naturally, we're concerned about specific sites. So you can see where the farm is. There was a number of sites around it, to the west and to the east and to the south. Specifically, there was the farm itself was right at the bottom of a hill with a sensitive triple SI right directly above it. It's been there, the farm has been there for years. There's lots of other farms in the area, dairy farms, that is. So it's, you know, so in terms of actually a change in emissions, on the balance, it looked like it was going to be an improvement, really. So what did we do? In this situation, instead of just doing what they asked, which is do a scale assessment and detailed modelling, we ended up doing a baseline assessment versus the proposed assessment. So we sort of modelled using a thing called the scale agriculture tool. We modelled the old buildings, 330 cows, which you get scraped twice a day, and with cows out grazing for 6 months of the year. And we modelled that against the new buildings with 330 cows housed all year round, low emissions flooring, slurry robots washing and scraping the floors all the time. We managed to model those two scenarios, and we managed to show that overall, across the ammonia, the total emission source, background concentrations, and the contributions, but overall there was going to be a reduction between the baseline scenario and the new scenario. And once we'd done that, yeah, the farmer was able to secure planning, which was obviously that's what they were after, really, and it was a good benefit for the family because the daughter was taking over the farm, and it was the natural progression to replace things, really, and improve. So what do we do? ADAS acts as a bridge between farmers and regulators, helping to interpret complex requirements and apply them practically. We assess whether a proposal would like to succeed under permitted development, or whether it will need a full planning application, and what the constraints around that are, and any requirements. Our consultants use tools like scale and nutrient neutrality to quantify impacts, and we then develop mitigation solutions that work on farm. We don't just produce technical documents. We prepare evidence packs written in a way that planners and Natural England and other regulators recognise and trust, and this reduces the risk of delays, objections, or refusals, and ultimately, I suppose, it gives farmers the confidence to invest in new infrastructure. And I suppose the value we bring is not only knowledge of the rules, but also an understanding of how to design projects around the constraints to achieve a successful outcome. So I'll hand back to Hannah now, if that's okay. And thank you for listening.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Charles and Brendan. That was very informative. Before we go on to questions, I just thought I'd let you all know about our one-to-one farm infrastructure clinic sessions that we're currently offering. These are online sessions via Teams like this, and they're designed to provide focused and practical advice tailored to your farm and individual circumstances. During these sessions, you'll work directly with an experienced consultant who can support you in areas such as slurry storage, handling, compliance, yard layout, increasing and decreasing herd sizes, water management, drainage, and cost-effective upgrades and future-proofing your farm. If this is something you'd be interested in, and further information, including the sign-up form, will be sent out by email if the QR code doesn't work. I think we might have had some questions in the chat if we have got time. Let me have a little look. So we've got, when building relevant infrastructure, you mentioned it not increasing net gain. In line with potential slurry regs, we will be needing to cover our slurry storage, which would realistically mean that we would need to make sure that make our concrete slurry storage to make it square or circular. Where would we stand in increasing net gain initially? So I think, Charles, is that something that you'd be able to answer? So basically, how would they increase their?
How would you achieve net gain from a development site where the footprint isn't changing and the habitat value of the existing was basically close to zero? Would that be have I interpreted that correctly?
Well, yeah, I think so. Yeah, so like I think what they're saying is they have to build a new, if they have to build a new slurry store to meet future rules,
Yep.
like covering stores to reduce emissions, um, even though it's required, how like reducing emissions in the long run. So I guess it's
So if
increasing environmental impact.
yes, so you've got a BNG requirement in England associated with that planning application, assuming that you need a planning application. So the first thing would be to look to see if that upgrade can be completed through permitted development and therefore not require any BNG input. And the second would be to look, you're not really going to be able to, if I'm right in assuming that you're looking at building on the existing site, then there isn't going to be a lot that you can do to increase the habitat value of the site. So you're going to have to go to something close by or alongside, ideally on the farm. As I think, going to the developer's approach of trying to buy credits off-site elsewhere is really not likely to be cost effective. So it's looking at what you can do close to home, and actually in that case probably on a relatively small scale, I would hope. The overhead cost of doing it's probably going to exceed the cost of the survey and coming up with the cunning plan is probably going to exceed the cost of actually establishing the habitat that you need to demonstrate that gain.
Brilliant. Thank you, Charles. We are running out of time, so if anyone has any other questions, then please do get in touch. As we come to the end of the webinar, I'd just like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us this evening. We hope you found it useful and informative. As I mentioned earlier, the webinar, including the basis points information and follow-up details, including the one-to-one farm infrastructure clinic sessions, will be sent out by email afterwards. And yeah, if you have any more questions, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. Yeah, I think in the chat is the form for the basis points. So yeah, thank you again and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Is there one more question?
Oh, is there?
Something's
Maybe.
just popped up.
Oh,
Something's just popped up. Come on, have one more question.
sorry. I have an existing dung store on a pad of concrete. It is less than 150 from the nearest neighbor, 150 meters from the nearest neighbor, and has been in place for at least 40 years. If I was to cover it with a shed, does that turn into a new store? For 2 minutes.
It's not a new storage area. It would be a new structure. So I did something similar, covering an existing feed yard because it was 250 meters from the neighbor. Despite the fact it had been a feed yard since about 1978, the word livestock was on the form, and therefore they said it's a full planning application. But from a air quality perspective, then actually you're going to be reducing emissions from that site. So that will be that will be a benefit. But it probably is going to be, unfortunately, full planning, despite having been in use for decades. There may be a slightly dubious and cunning way of describing it as roofing existing storage area, but I really wouldn't want to recommend that, as I think they might frown upon it if they realised exactly what you were proposing to roof.
That's all questions.
Any more for any more?
I don't think there was. Any more in the chat?
No. Okay. Very good. Well, thanks everyone for joining us, and yeah, I will catch up with some of you later, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.